Somewhere in the last hour, your mind did a piece of arithmetic it never does in daylight. It stopped counting instances and started counting the whole thing, not this month, all of it. Every year of it added up into one number of money or of time or of what it cost the people in the next room and handed to you without installments. You know the number. You have probably run it more than once tonight. After enough years, the question changes. It stops being, what should I do with my life, and becomes something quieter and much harder to put down. What have I been doing over and over that I decided to stop years ago and did not stop? Tonight, one man answers that honestly, in writing, in his own hand, more than 100 times. On the 1st of July, 1865, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky signed the worst contract in the history of Russian literature, and he signed it because of a habit he had been unable to break for 3 years and would be unable to break for 6 more. We are going to be gentle with this. It responds badly to anything else. Chapter 1. The thing you have not stopped doing. Begin with why you might be listening to this at 1 in the morning. Almost everybody past a certain age is carrying something they have decided to stop more than once and have not stopped. It does not have to be dramatic. It very often is not. It might be the drinking, and it might be the phone, and it might be a job that has been quietly costing you for 11 years. It might be a person you keep going back to. It might be money going somewhere it should not. It might be a habit so small that saying it out loud would be embarrassing, which is its own kind of trap, because a thing too small to confess is a thing you have to carry alone. The common feature is not the behaviour. The common feature is the gap. You know. You have known for a long time. You have made the decision sincerely on several occasions, and each time you meant it entirely. And then a fortnight later, or a Tuesday later, there you are again, and the strange part is not that you did it, it is that at the moment of doing it, you were not fighting anything. It simply happened, and the argument you had prepared did not come up. That gap between knowing and doing is the most disorienting thing a person can find in themselves, because it undermines the basic assumption you operate on all day, which is that you are the one steering. And at 1 in the morning, with nothing else in the room, it becomes the only subject. There is a second feature of it that is worth naming, because it is the one that makes people feel most alone. The gap is invisible from outside. Nobody watching you can see it. From outside, there is only the behaviour, arriving at intervals, apparently chosen, apparently deliberate, apparently the expression of what you actually want. So the people around you conclude, quite reasonably, that you must want it, because otherwise you would stop. And you cannot correct that impression, because to correct it, you would have to explain the gap. And the gap is precisely the thing there is no ordinary language for. So you end up agreeing with them. You adopt their explanation of yourself, because it is the only one on offer, and their explanation is that you are the sort of person who does this. That is the sentence you are lying under at 1 in the morning, not the behaviour, the explanation you accepted for it, from people who were doing their best with what they could see. Most of tonight is an attempt to give you a better one. There is a second feature of it that is worth naming, because it is the one that makes people feel most alone. The gap is invisible from outside. Nobody watching can see it. From outside, there is only the behaviour, arriving at intervals, apparently chosen, apparently deliberate, apparently an expression of what you actually want. So the people around you conclude, quite reasonably, that you must want it, because otherwise you would stop. And you cannot correct that impression, because to correct it, you would have to explain the gap. And the gap is exactly the thing there is no ordinary language for. So in the end, you adopt their account of yourself because it is the only one on offer, and their account is that you are the sort of person who does this. That is the sentence you are lying under tonight. Not the behaviour, the explanation you accepted for it, from people doing their best with what they could see. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of your body settle into whatever is holding it. There is nothing to decide in the next 3 hours. Nothing here is going to ask you to commit to anything, and if your attention drifts off and comes back in the middle somewhere, that is fine, and it is what this is for. Chapter 2, it is not the winning. Here is the first thing worth understanding, and it applies far beyond the specific case tonight. You would assume that what holds a person is the good part, the pleasure, the win. That the reason somebody cannot stop is that it feels too good to give up. That is not what the evidence shows, and it is not what the letters of the man we are discussing show. What holds people is losing. Dostoevsky won sometimes. He had at least one large win, and winning did not produce the letters. The letters that survive, hundreds of them, are written after losing, and they are all the same letter, and what they describe is not craving, they describe a debt to be corrected. He does not write, "I want to play." He writes, "I am so close, and I need a small amount more, and then it will be put right." This is the single most important structural fact about the whole phenomenon, and it is why willpower is such a poor instrument against it. You are not fighting a pleasure. You are fighting the intolerable state of being behind, and every additional attempt makes the state of being behind worse, which increases the pressure to make another attempt. That is not weakness. That is a loop with the wrong sign on it. And there is a further turn of it that is worth having, because it explains the specific quality of the hours after. If the behaviour were about pleasure, then the natural end of an episode would be satisfaction. You would have had the thing, and you would be finished with it for a while, the way you are finished with a meal. But if the behaviour is about correcting a deficit, then the natural end of an episode is a larger deficit, which means that the moment the episode ends is the moment of maximum pressure to begin another one. That is why the hours immediately afterwards are the worst hours, and it is why the promise made in those hours is always sincere and never survives. The promise is being made at the point of maximum pain, by a person who is at that moment further behind than they have ever been, and the same fact that produces the sincerity of the promise also produces the pressure that will break it. Nothing about that is a moral event. It is a system with feedback in the wrong direction, and the person inside it is the last one in a position to see it. And it generalizes. The reason people cannot leave the job is not that the job is good. It is the 11 years already in it. The reason people go back is not that it was ever pleasant. It is what has already been spent. We will come back to this with the actual research, and it has a name. And there is a further turn of it, which explains the particular quality of the hours afterwards. If the behaviour were about pleasure, then the natural end of an episode would be satisfaction. You would have had the thing and be done with it for a while, the way you are done with a meal. But if the behaviour is about correcting a deficit, then the natural end of an episode is a larger deficit, which means the moment it ends is the moment of maximum pressure to begin another one. That is why the hours immediately after are the worst hours, and it is why the promise made in those hours is always completely sincere and never survives. The promise is being made at the point of maximum pain by somebody who is at that exact moment further behind than they have ever been, and the same fact that produces the sincerity of the promise produces the pressure that will break it. None of that is a moral event. It is a system with the feedback running the wrong way, and the person inside it is the last one placed to see it. There is one more thing about losing that I want to put down early, because it will matter at the end. Losing is information, and the information is bad, and the mind does not like receiving it. Every loss says something you do not want to hear. That the method does not work, that the time was wasted, that the theory was wrong. And there is a very reliable way to avoid receiving that information, which is to keep going, because as long as it is not over, the verdict is not in. Stopping is what makes the loss real. Continuing is what keeps it provisional. That is the whole engine, not greed. An unwillingness to let the result be counted. One last note before the story starts. Nothing in the next 3 hours is going to ask you to admit anything, or to name the thing, or to decide about it. You can listen to the whole of this as a piece of history about a Russian novelist and take nothing personally at all, and that is a perfectly good way to use it. The transfer, if there is one, will happen on its own later, probably on a Tuesday, and probably about something I have not mentioned. That is the shape of it, and we will come back to it at the end. Chapter 3. The arithmetic at this hour and what this evening is not. There is a specific mental operation that happens at 1 in the morning and does not happen at 11 in the morning, and it is worth naming so you can recognize it when it starts. It is the total. During the day you deal with instances. Today was not good, or this week has been expensive, or I should sort that out. Manageable units, each one small enough to think about. At 1 in the morning, the mind does something it never does in daylight, which is to add them all up. Not this month. All of it. Every year of it. And it produces one enormous figure of money or of time or of what it costs the people around you, and presents it as a single number with no installments. And the number is always presented in the abstract form, which makes it impossible to answer. Not, I have spent this on that, but look what you have done with your life. The reason it is unbearable is not the size of it. It is that a total has no next action attached. An instance can be dealt with. A total can only be regretted. I would ask you, when that starts tonight, to notice that the totaling is a thing your mind is doing at this hour, not a fact that has newly arrived. The number was there yesterday afternoon, and you were fine. Nothing changed except the hour, and the availability of a part of your mind that likes to add. 2 pieces of housekeeping before the story. The first is what this is not. Nothing tonight is medical advice or financial advice or a diagnosis, and there is nothing in it that is an argument for anybody to gamble. If any of this is live in your house at the moment, there are people whose entire job it is in every country, and they are free, and they are considerably better at it than a recording. There is a line about it in the description, and I mean it. The second concerns the sources, because this is one of the best documented private lives of the 19th century, and I want you to know why. We have his letters in enormous quantity, including the ones written in the worst hours, because his wife kept everything. We have her diary, kept in shorthand during the first year of the marriage, which she wrote in a code her husband could not read, precisely so that she could be honest in it. And we have her memoir, written decades later, in old age, which is a considered and rather magnificent book. That last one needs a small caution. A memoir written 40 years after the events, by a woman who had by then spent her whole widowhood managing her husband's reputation, is not a neutral instrument. She is protective of him. She smooths things. Where the diary and the memoir disagree, historians generally take the diary. But the extraordinary thing is that even in the protective version, she does not hide it. She could have. She chose not to. And what she wrote down instead is, I think, the most useful document in this whole story, which we will get to at the end. A third piece of housekeeping, which is about the shape of the evening rather than its content. I am going to keep the story and the evidence visibly apart. For the first half, we are in 1865 with a man whose letters we have. For the second half, we are in the research, which has nothing to do with him and was done on ordinary people in laboratories a century later. You will hear the seam. I will say, when we cross it. The reason for that is not pedantry. This subject in particular attracts a kind of writing where a vivid story is told and then quietly used as proof of a general claim, and the reader is carried over the gap by the quality of the anecdote. At 1 a.m, with the checking apparatus off duty, that is extremely effective and almost entirely worthless. So, story, then evidence, and a join you can see. One more note on the sources, because there is a specific reason this particular life is so well documented and it is worth knowing. Anna kept everything. Not selectively, everything. The letters that made him look bad, the notes about money, the pawn tickets. She catalogued it, preserved it, and spent 37 years after his death organizing it into an archive. Which means the unflattering material survives at the same rate as the flattering material, and that is extraordinarily rare. Most reputations are curated by somebody with an interest, and the interested party usually loses the awkward documents. She did not. That is why we can be as specific as we are going to be tonight. Chapter 4. Wiesbaden, 1862, and the system he believed in. He came to it late, which is worth knowing. He was 40 when he first played roulette, in the summer of 1862, on his first trip outside Russia. He had been in prison in Siberia. He had served in the army. He had come back to Petersburg and rebuilt a career. He was not a young man being reckless with an inheritance. He was a middle-aged professional writer on his first holiday abroad who walked into a spa casino in Wiesbaden because everybody did. And he won. That detail matters enormously. And we will come back to it in the research, because a first experience that is a win is one of the more reliable ways to build a durable habit. He walked out with a considerable sum, and what he took away from it was not the money. What he took away was an explanation. He believed, and he believed it for a decade, that he had understood something about roulette that other people had not. The system was not mathematical. He wrote it out several times in letters, and it is always the same, and it is always psychological. The secret, he said, was to remain absolutely cold, to calculate without any excitement at all. Most people, he observed, lose because they become agitated and start to deviate from what they had planned. He had seen it. He was right about the observation. And his conclusion was that a man who could hold himself still and simply follow the plan would come out ahead. Now, here is the exact size of the error, and it is worth being precise about it because the same error runs through an enormous number of ordinary lives. He was correct that agitation makes people play worse. He was wrong that playing well changes the outcome. It is worth being precise about the size of the disadvantage, because people generally imagine it is larger and more dramatic than it is, and its actual smallness is the trap. On the wheel he played, the house advantage was in the region of a few percent per spin. That is all. It is not a machine that takes your money quickly. Over an evening, you can very easily come out ahead, and a great many people do, which is exactly the problem. A small edge applied many times is invisible in any one session and inevitable across a life. So, the evidence available to a player is genuinely ambiguous. He is not observing a machine that always takes. He is observing a machine that gives about as often as it takes and quietly keeps a sliver, which means his theory was never confronted by an obvious refutation. There was no evening on which the wheel announced itself. There were only good nights and bad nights in a distribution that looked exactly like the distribution any skill would produce, and a man of considerable intelligence sitting in front of it, drawing the natural conclusion. If the disadvantage had been 50%, nobody would ever have developed a system. It is precisely because it is small that it is undetectable, and precisely because it is undetectable that it is inescapable. Roulette has a fixed, known, negative expected value. Every spin is independent. There is no ordering of bets, no discipline, no self-command, no coldness that alters it. The house edge is a property of the wheel, not of the player. And the more you play, the more certainly it expresses itself. So he had built an entire theory in which the thing that determined the result was his own character, in a game where his own character was the one variable that could not possibly matter. And that is a very seductive structure, because it means every loss is evidence not that the theory is wrong, but that he had not been cold enough, which is unfalsifiable, and which converts every failure into a reason to try again. Better. If you want to know why he could not stop for 10 years, that is a large part of it, and there is nothing stupid about it. It is a smart man's mistake. It is worth being exact about the size of the disadvantage, because people generally imagine it is larger and more dramatic than it is, and its actual smallness is the trap. On the wheel he played, the house advantage was in the region of a few percent per spin. That is all. It is not a machine that takes your money quickly. Over an evening, you can very easily come out ahead, and a great many people do, which is precisely the problem. A small edge applied many times is invisible in any single session and inevitable across a life. So the evidence available to a player is genuinely ambiguous. He is not watching a machine that always takes. He is watching a machine that gives about as often as it takes and quietly keeps a sliver. Which means his theory was never confronted by an obvious refutation. There was no evening on which the wheel announced itself. There were only good nights and bad nights, in a distribution that looked exactly like the distribution any skill would produce, and an intelligent man sitting in front of it drawing the natural conclusion. If the disadvantage had been 50%, nobody would ever have developed a system. It is because it is small that it is undetectable, and because it is undetectable that it is inescapable. There is a version of that in ordinary life that has nothing to do with money, and it is worth having. Anything with a small, persistent cost and a noisy, short-term signal will do this to you. The job that is very slightly wrong. The relationship that is fine most weeks. The habit that costs an hour a day. None of them ever announces itself. Each individual instance is well within the range of normal. The only way to see it is to stop looking at instances and look at the total across years, which is exactly the operation your mind performs at 1 a.m. and refuses to perform at any other time. That is why this hour is so painful and also, occasionally, so useful. Chapter 5. The year everything went. 1964 was the worst year of his life to that point, and to understand the contract, you have to understand what he was carrying when he signed it. In April, his wife Maria died of tuberculosis. The marriage had not been happy, and he was, by his own account, wrecked anyway. In July, his brother Mikhail died suddenly. They had been close their whole lives, and they had been running a magazine together which had already been shut down once by the censors and restarted under a different name. Mikhail left debts, and a widow, and 4 children. Dostoevsky was not legally responsible for any of it. He took it on anyway. He assumed his brother's debts, which were substantial, and undertook to support the family. He also had his late wife's son from her first marriage, Pasha, who was a young man of no great application and who continued to require money for years. The magazine failed within a year. So by the summer of 1865, he was a widower of 43, keeping 2 households that were not his own, carrying a dead man's debts with creditors who could have him arrested, and no capital. I want to put a marker down here, because the standard version of this story presents a man who gambled away his money. That is not quite what happened. He was already in the hole before the worst of the gambling, and he was in the hole largely because he had picked up other people's obligations that he could have declined, which is a much more familiar shape and a much less comfortable one. The people who end up in an impossible position are very often not the reckless ones. They are the ones who said yes to something they were not obliged to say yes to on a day when saying no would have felt unbearable. It is worth adding what he was actually like in those months, because the popular image of Dostoevsky is of a brooding figure, and the reality was closer to a man running a small, failing business badly. He was doing sums constantly. The letters are full of them. What is owed to whom, which creditor can be put off, what a chapter might raise, what the interest is. He was managing his late brother's widow's household expenses. He was arguing about money with his stepson. He was writing to editors asking for advances against books not yet begun, which is the single clearest indicator anywhere in his correspondence of what state he was in, because a writer who is selling next year's work to pay for last year's has already lost control of the arithmetic. And underneath all of it, there is the epilepsy, which was severe, and which he tracked in his notebooks with a doctor's precision, the dates, the severity, how many days he lost afterwards. A seizure cost him not just the day, but the several days following, in which he could not work at all. So the picture is a man of 43, recently twice bereaved, with a chronic illness that unpredictably removed a week at a time, running 3 households on money he did not have, against deadlines. Anybody would look for a door out of that. His was a worse door than most, but the search for a door was not a pathology. It is worth adding what he was actually like in those months, because the popular image of Dostoevsky is of a brooding figure, and the reality was closer to a man running a small, failing business badly. He was doing sums constantly. The letters are full of them. What is owed to whom, which creditor can be put off another fortnight, what a chapter might raise, what the interest is. He was managing his late brother's widow's household expenses. He was arguing about money with his stepson, who was not inclined to work. He was writing to editors asking for advances against books not yet begun, which is the single clearest indicator anywhere in his correspondence of the state he was in, because a writer selling next year's work to pay for last year's has already lost control of the arithmetic. And underneath all of it, there was the epilepsy, which was severe, and which he tracked in his notebooks with a physician's precision, the date, the severity, the days lost after. A seizure cost him not only the day, but the several days following, in which he could not work at all. So the picture is a man of 43, twice bereaved in a year, with a chronic illness that unpredictably removed a week at a time, running 3 households on money he did not have against deadlines. Anybody would look for a door out of that. His was a worse door than most. But the search for a door was not a pathology, and I would rather you had him in view as a competent man in an impossible position than as a compulsive in a casino. One more figure belongs in that year, and she is usually left out entirely. Emilia Fyodorovna, his brother's widow, and her 4 children. He supported that household for years. Not generously, and not without complaint in his letters, but continuously, out of money he did not have, while she wrote to him about what she needed, and he wrote to editors asking for advances to cover it. It is worth holding on to, because the standard account of these years has him losing money at tables, and the fuller account has him losing money at tables while also funding 2 households that were not his on borrowed capital for the better part of a decade. Neither fact excuses the other. But the second one changes what kind of man is standing at the table. And it is not the one in the popular version. Chapter 6. The Bargain. So Stellovsky. He was a publisher with a reputation, and the reputation was that he bought cheap from people in trouble. He had bought up some of Dostoevsky's outstanding debts, which meant he arrived at the negotiation already holding a weapon. The offer was 3,000 roubles. For that, he would get the right to a 3-volume collected edition of the existing work, and 1 new novel of a specified minimum length, delivered by the 1st of November 1866. And then the clause. If the novel was not delivered by that date, all rights to everything Dostoevsky wrote for the following 9 years would pass to Stellovsky without further payment. 9 years. A man of 43 with, as it turned out, 16 years to live, signing away more than half of his remaining working life on a deadline he had every reason to know he might miss. He knew what he was signing, he was not deceived, and he said afterwards that he had known. And the reason he signed it is the reason anybody signs anything like it, which is that the alternative was a problem this week, and the clause was a problem next year, and at the moment of signing, next year is a rumour. That is not stupidity either. That is the ordinary architecture of a person under pressure, and it has been measured. A cost that arrives later is discounted steeply, and the steepness increases the more pressure you are under. The contract was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of the future to feel real, which is a thing that happens to everybody and happens most to people who are frightened. There is a specific mechanism at work in that signature, and it has been measured, which is worth knowing because it operates on everybody and it is not a character flaw. A cost that arrives later is worth less to us than a cost that arrives now. That is not irrational in itself. A pound today genuinely is worth more than a pound in a year. What is irrational is the shape of the curve. We do not discount smoothly. We discount very steeply in the near term and then almost flatly further out, which means that a consequence 2 months away and a consequence 2 years away feel almost identical, while a consequence today and a consequence next week feel enormously different. The practical result is that any arrangement offering relief now and disaster later will feel, at the moment of signing, like a good trade, not a gamble taken knowingly. A good trade. And the steepness increases under pressure. Fatigue, stress, hunger, fear, and time scarcity all make the near term louder. Which means the moment at which a person is most likely to sign the worst possible contract is precisely the moment they are least able to see it as one. He was not stupid, and he was not weak. He was a frightened man doing arithmetic with a distorted exchange rate between now and later, and every one of us has that exchange rate. The only defense anybody has found is not better judgment in the moment. It is not being in the moment alone, making the decision somewhere else at another time with another person in the room. Chapter 7. What he did with the 3,000 and the novel he wrote instead. The money arrived. Most of it went where it had to go, to the creditors who were closest to acting. And then he took what was left and went to Wiesbaden. I want to sit with that for a moment without editorializing, because the reflex is to call it self-destruction, and I do not think that is right, and I think getting it right matters for what comes later. Put yourself in the position. You have just signed away 9 years of your working life to buy a few months of relief. The relief has already evaporated, because the money went straight out again to people who were owed more than it. You are now in exactly the same position as before, except that you have also lost the 9 years. What is the only thing available that could change any of that? Not writing. Writing pays slowly, in installments, against a debt that grows faster. There is exactly one mechanism in the world, as it presents itself to a man in that position, that can produce a large sum in a short time. He was not throwing money away. He was doing the only arithmetic that produced a survivable answer. And the arithmetic was wrong. And it was the only one that offered a way out, which is precisely why he could not stop doing it. That is the shape of it. It looks like recklessness from outside. From inside, it feels like the only door. He lost it in a few days. And then, in Wiesbaden, out of money, with the hotel refusing to serve him meals and eventually taking away his candles so that he could not work in the evenings, he sat down and began to write something. It was not the novel he owed Stellovsky. It was another one entirely, and it became Crime and Punishment. That is worth stopping on. The most famous psychological novel of the 19th century was begun by a man in a hotel room in a German spa town. Immediately after losing everything at roulette, while writing letters to everyone he knew, asking for enough money to leave. And the book he began is about a man who commits a terrible act and then cannot live inside his own head afterwards, and who is not caught by evidence, but by the fact of not being able to bear himself. He was not writing about a murderer. He was writing about the state he was in. Through 1866, the novel appeared in installments in a magazine called The Russian Messenger, month by month, written just ahead of the printer. It was an enormous success. And every month that he spent on it was a month not spent on the novel he had actually been paid for, whose deadline was coming. There is a detail from those weeks in Wiesbaden that I keep returning to, because it is the most human thing in the whole story. He wrote to Turgenev. Ivan Turgenev, who was already famous, already comfortable, and with whom Dostoevsky had an uneasy relationship that would later collapse into open hostility, he asked him for 100 thalers. Turgenev sent 50. Dostoevsky did not repay it for years, and the debt sat between them and poisoned things further, and there is a scene in Baden-Baden 2 years later where the whole thing goes up. I mention it because of what it tells you about the position he was in. He was not writing to friends. He had exhausted the friends. He was writing to a man he did not much like, who did not much like him, for an amount of money that was trivial to the recipient and decisive to him. Almost everybody who has been in serious trouble with money knows the specific humiliation of that particular letter. The one to the person you would least like to ask, written because the list of people you would prefer to ask has run out. It is worth saying plainly that this is a normal stage of a normal process, that a very large number of otherwise capable people have written that letter, and that the shame attached to it is out of all proportion to what it actually signifies, which is only that you ran out of easier options before you ran out of need. Chapter 8, the 1st of October, and a practical suggestion. By the beginning of October 1866, Crime and Punishment was most of the way finished, and the Stellovsky novel did not exist. Not a draft, not a sketch, nothing. He had a month. The required length was substantial, something on the order of a short novel. He had never in his life written at that rate, and he had reason to believe that Stellovsky wanted him to fail. There is no smoking gun for that, and honest historians say so, but the circumstantial case is strong. a publisher who had bought up the debts of a man in trouble, who had inserted a clause of that severity, and who then, as we will see, made himself conveniently unavailable in the last days of the deadline. His friends were, by all accounts, frantic. Several of them offered to write chapters for him, dividing the book between them, and to publish it under his name. He refused. He said he would not put his name to work he had not written, which, in the circumstances, with 9 years of his life on the table, is worth noticing. The idea that saved him came from a writer called Alexander Milyukov, an old friend. And it was not a literary idea, it was a logistical one. Milyukov suggested he hire a stenographer. Shorthand was, at that moment, a very new technology in Russia. Systems for taking down speech at the speed it is spoken had been developed in Western Europe and were only just arriving. There was a man in Petersburg named Pavel Olkin who had opened one of the first courses in it, and among his students was a small number of young women, which was itself unusual. The proposal was that Dostoevsky should stop trying to write the novel and should instead say it out loud at speed to somebody who could take it down and have it transcribed overnight. He did not like the idea. He had never dictated anything. He was a writer who worked slowly, in pen, with a great deal of crossing out. He agreed because there was nothing else. Milyukov went to Olkin. Olkin recommended his best student. On the 3rd of October, she was told there was a job with a writer, and asked whether she would take it. She was told his name, and she said yes immediately because she had read him. It is worth pausing on what his friends offered, because it is a good illustration of how badly help is usually designed. They offered to write the book for him. Several of them, according to the accounts, proposed dividing the novel into sections, writing a section each, and publishing the result under his name. It would have worked. It would have satisfied the contract. Nobody would have known, and he refused, and the refusal is usually reported as a point of honor, which it partly was. But notice what was wrong with the offer as help. It solved the problem by removing him from it. It required him to accept that he could not do the thing permanently in front of the people he most wanted not to say that to. And it left him afterwards with a book he had not written and a debt of gratitude to 4 people. The offer that actually worked was different in every respect. It did not do the work for him. It changed the conditions under which he did the work himself. It cost him nothing in standing, because dictating is still writing, and it came from a stranger who was being paid, which meant it created no obligation at all. That distinction is worth having, whichever side of it you are on. The help that gets accepted is almost never the help that takes the task away. It is the help that changes the conditions and leaves the person their own work. Chapter 9, the 4th of October, and how the days actually went. She arrived at 11:30 in the morning at an apartment on Stolyarny Lane. She was 20 years old. Her name was Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. Her father had recently died. She had taken the shorthand course partly to be able to earn, and she was, by her teacher's assessment, the best in the class. She had also, as a girl, read his books, and had been told that the author had been sentenced to death and sent to Siberia, and had built an idea of him in her head. What she found was a man of 45 who looked much older, in a poorly kept apartment, distracted, pale, with a nervous manner, who forgot her name twice in the first hour and called her by the wrong one, who offered her a cigarette which she declined, and who talked in a way she found disjointed and hard to follow. She wrote later that she left that first meeting disappointed and close to deciding not to come back. She came back. And what happened over the following 26 days is one of the more remarkable working relationships in the history of literature, and almost none of it was romantic at the time. The arrangement was simple and brutal. She came at midday. He dictated. She took it down in shorthand at speaking speed for several hours. Then she went home, and in the evening, and often late into the night, she transcribed the shorthand into ordinary longhand, which is the slow part, because shorthand is only readable to the person who wrote it and only for a limited time afterwards. She brought the transcription back the next day. He read it, corrected it, and dictated onward. That is a full working day for him and a full working day plus a night shift for her every day for 26 days. And the thing that made it work was not the technology. It was that dictation suited him and nobody had known. He was, it turned out, a natural talker. The novel that came out of those weeks is written in the first person, in the voice of a young man telling you what happened to him, and it moves at the speed of speech, and it is the least laboured thing he ever produced. There is something in that for anybody who has ever been stuck on something for a long time. He had been unable to write that novel for 15 months. The obstacle was not the story, it was the medium. Change how the thing comes out of you, and a 15-month block can turn out to have been a technical problem. It is worth saying something about her, because she is usually described as the young stenographer and then absorbed into the story as an instrument. Anna Grigorievna Snitkina was 20, and she had chosen this. Her father had died recently. The family had some means, but not much. And she had enrolled in one of the first shorthand courses in Russia, which was a new technology, on the reasoning that a woman with a rare technical skill would be able to earn. That is a strategic decision made by a 20-year-old in 1866, in a country where the professions were closed to her, and it is exactly the decision somebody would make today. She was also, by her teacher's account, the best student in the course. When the job came up, he sent her, not because she needed the money most, but because the deadline was insane and she was the fastest. And she nearly did not go back after the first day. Her diary records a man who was distracted, who could not remember her name, who talked in a way she found disjointed, and a flat that was in poor order. She left thinking she had made a mistake. She went back because she had said she would. That is the whole of it. The 9 years turn on a 20-year-old, keeping an appointment she was not looking forward to, which is a smaller and more available kind of decisive act than the ones stories usually run on. Chapter 10. What the Gambler Actually Is. I should say something about the book itself, because most people have never read it and assume it is a moral tale. It is not a warning. It is a description written from inside the thing while the writer was still in it. And that is what makes it strange. It is narrated by a young tutor working for a Russian family in a fictional German spa town. And it is at least as much about the family and about a woman he is ruinously attached to, and about a magnificent old aunt who arrives from Russia and proceeds to lose an enormous fortune at the tables over a few days, in a way that is genuinely funny and then genuinely terrible. And it contains, in the middle of it, passages of description of what it is like to be at the table that are so exact that they have been quoted in the clinical literature ever since. The narrowing, the way the room goes away, the specific quality of thinking that says one more and means it. The point I want to make is this. He wrote the most accurate description of the state anybody had produced in the middle of being unable to get out of it in 26 days under a deadline to escape a contract he had signed because of it. Understanding it perfectly did nothing. He had another 5 years of it in front of him. Insight is not a lever. If you are lying there tonight, feeling stupid for having understood your own pattern completely and still being in it, that is not a special failing of yours. That is the normal relationship between understanding and behaviour. And the man who wrote the definitive account of it went straight back to the table. There is one passage in it that has been quoted in the clinical literature ever since, and it is worth describing because it is the most accurate thing anybody wrote about this before the 20th century. He describes the narrowing, the room going away, the other players ceasing to exist, the specific quality of attention in which there is no past and no future and no money, only the next spin, and the extraordinary relief of that. And he describes the way the intention changes without being noticed. The man arrives having decided to stake a fixed amount. He does not decide to exceed it. There is no moment of decision at all. The limit simply stops being a feature of the situation, and afterwards he cannot locate the point at which it stopped being one. That is a first-person account of something that would not be described in the research literature for another century, written by a man who was still in it and had another 5 years to go. Which brings us to the finding that the whole first half of tonight has been circling. He understood it perfectly. He could describe it better than his doctors, and it made no difference whatsoever. If you have been lying there feeling stupid for having understood your own pattern completely and still being inside it, that is not a special failing of yours. That is the ordinary relationship between insight and behaviour, and the man who wrote the definitive description of it went straight back to the tables. Chapter 11. The 29th of October. They finished on the 29th or 30th of October, 1866. The accounts differ by a day. Around 7 printers' sheets. Something over 200 pages. Dictated and transcribed in 26 days. And then the last piece of the story, which is the part that makes it fiction grade. He took the manuscript to Stellovsky's office to deliver it with a day or two in hand. Stellovsky was not there. His office said he had gone away and they had no authority to accept anything. He tried again. He was told the same. He went to the police station in the district in the hope of registering it there and was told at that station that they could not take it either. He was with hours left in the position of having written the book and having no way to hand it over. And you can see the shape of what was happening. The contract did not say he had to write it. It said he had to deliver it. Producing a manuscript that nobody would accept is worth precisely nothing. The solution came from Anna, or from Anna and her mother. the accounts differ slightly, and it is her memoir that records it either way. The advice was to find the police station of the district in which Stellovsky actually lived, rather than the one where his office was, and to deposit the manuscript there against a dated receipt, because a delivery to the correct official body on the correct date is a delivery in law whether or not the man is in the country. He did it. He got the receipt. It was the 1st of November 1866, and it was the last legal hour, and it held. He kept the rights to 9 years of his own work because a 20-year-old stenographer knew how a receipt works. There is an irony in that ending which I think is worth sitting with for a moment. The whole crisis had been produced by a document, a contract with a clause in it signed on an afternoon which threatened to take 9 years. And the crisis was resolved by a document, a dated receipt from a police station which secured them. The problem was administrative and the solution was administrative. At no point did anybody's character enter into it. The 9 years did not turn on whether Dostoevsky was a good man or a strong one. They turned on whether a piece of paper existed with the correct date on it. I labour this because at 1 in the morning the mind insists that the important things in a life are settled at the level of character, and that if a situation is going badly, it must be because of what sort of person you are. Almost none of it is settled there. An enormous proportion of what determines how a life goes is settled at the level of arrangements. What you signed, what you did not read, who holds the money, whether a form was filed, whether somebody nearby happened to know a piece of practical information. That is a much less dignified account of a life, and it is very much better news, because arrangements can be changed on a Tuesday by an ordinary person in an ordinary mood, and character cannot be changed at all by lying in the dark being disappointed in it. There is a small administrative detail in that ending which is worth pulling out, because it is the most transferable thing in the story. The receipt. Everything turned on a piece of paper with a date on it, issued by a clerk in a building on the correct day. Not on his talent, not on his character, not on the quality of the novel, which nobody at the police station read, on whether a form existed. I labour it because at 1 in the morning the mind insists that the important things in a life are settled at the level of character, and that if things are going badly, it must be because of what sort of person you are. Almost none of it is settled there. An enormous proportion of how a life goes is settled at the level of arrangements. What you signed, what you did not read, who holds the money, whether a form was filed, whether somebody nearby happened to know a piece of practical information at the right moment. That is a much less dignified account of a life, and it is very much better news, because arrangements can be changed on a Tuesday by an ordinary person in an ordinary mood, and character cannot be changed at all by lying in the dark being disappointed in it. One small thing about that day, which is the sort of detail that only survives because somebody kept the paperwork. He got the receipt with hours to spare, not days. The delivery was on the 1st of November. The contract expired on the 1st of November. There was no margin at all, which means that if the office had closed earlier, or the clerk had been unhelpful, or the journey across Petersburg had gone badly, none of the previous 26 days would have counted for anything. Everything he did was necessary, and none of it was sufficient. The sufficient part was a piece of administration completed in the last available hour by somebody who knew where to go. Chapter 12. The proposal, and then it got worse. He finished Crime and Punishment in the weeks that followed, with her help. And then, in November, he asked her to marry him, and the way he did it is worth telling because it is entirely characteristic. He did not ask her. He described a story he said he was thinking of writing, about an artist, no longer young, in poor health, who had been through a great deal, and who meets a young girl, and he asked her what she thought such a girl would answer if the artist asked her to marry him. She said she would answer that she loved him and would love him all her life. They were married on the 15th of February, 1867. He was 45, she was 20. The marriage lasted 14 years, until his death, and by every account, including the ones from people who did not like him, it was the making of him. Now here is where the story refuses to behave. You would expect the happy ending here. The devoted young wife arrives, the man is saved, the gambling stops. It did not stop. It got worse. Within weeks of the wedding, they left Russia, ostensibly for his health, actually to escape his creditors and to escape the relatives who were living off him. They meant to be away for 3 months. They were away for 4 years and a bit. And those 4 years were the worst of the gambling by a wide margin. Not the years before he met her, the years after. Dresden, Hamburg, Baden-Baden, Geneva, Vevey, Milan, Florence, and back. He would go to the tables, lose, come back, and it would happen again. He pawned things. He pawned her things. I want to be careful here not to turn her into a saint and him into a monster, because the diary does not support either. But the facts of what he pawned are on the record, and they are these: her earrings, her brooch, a fur coat, a shawl, his own overcoat, his watch, and her wedding ring. Some of them more than once, because things came back out of pawn when a win happened and went in again the following week. They were, at points, in rooms they could not pay for, eating very little with a pregnant wife in a foreign country where neither of them had anybody. Before we go into those 4 years, I want to set something up, because otherwise this next part is simply grim, and it is not. The obvious reading of what follows is that she was a victim of it. That a young woman married a compulsive gambler and paid for it for 4 years in a foreign country. That reading is available, and it is not baseless, and I am not going to talk you out of it entirely. But it is not the reading her own documents support, and hers are the ones we have. The diary of that first year is the diary of somebody who is homesick and jealous, and frequently bored and occasionally furious, and who is also unmistakably running an operation. She is watching. She is testing what makes the episodes shorter. She is noticing what makes them worse. She is keeping records. By the time they came home in 1871, she had a working model of her husband's behaviour, assembled from 4 years of close observation, and she then used it to restructure their entire financial life, so successfully that the debts were gone within a few years, and she became one of the more capable publishers in Russia. That is not a passenger. That is somebody doing fieldwork under difficult conditions. I want that in view before we read the letters, because the letters on their own give you only his half, and his half is the loud half. Chapter 13. The letters. There are a great many letters from those years, because He would go to another town to play and write to her from it. They follow a form so regular that you could set your watch by it, and the form is the thing I want you to hear, because it is not the form of a man enjoying himself. First, the arrival and a plan. He has worked it out. He will play carefully and coldly and only for a set time. Then the loss. Then the letter. And the letter is always the same three movements. An extraordinarily full and unsparing confession in which he calls himself contemptible in language you would not use about an enemy. Then a passage of self-abasement toward her specifically, that she is better than him, that he is not worthy, that he has behaved like a beast. And then, in the last paragraph, sometimes in the postscript, the request. Please send 50 roubles. Please pawn something. Please send it by return because I am at the hotel and cannot leave. She sent it. Nearly every time. And here we arrive at the hinge of the entire episode, because there is an obvious question and it has an answer that the research supports and the folklore does not. Why on earth did she keep sending the money? Before we answer it, I want to give you her side of those years in a little more detail, because she is very easy to turn into a symbol, and she was in fact a young woman a long way from home having a difficult time. She was 21 when they left Russia. She had never been abroad. She spoke no German at the outset. She was pregnant within months. She was cut off from her mother and her sister and everybody she had grown up with, in a series of rented rooms in towns where she knew nobody, married to a man 25 years older with a chronic illness and a habit. Her diary from that first year is not the diary of a saint. She is homesick, she is bored, she is jealous. At length and in detail about a woman from his past. She records petty irritations about his manners at meals. She writes about wanting new gloves and not being able to have them, and she is quite clear about the indignity of it. And she also records, again and again, that he came back and told her everything, and that she did not scold him. I find that combination far more persuasive than serenity would have been. She was not above it. She was not a woman with no feelings about the pawned ring. She had every one of the feelings you would have, and she wrote them down in a private code, and then she went out and behaved in a way that did not add to the problem. That is a thing an ordinary person can actually do. Feeling calm is not available on demand. Not saying the sentence is. There is a pattern in those letters that is worth naming, because it is the thing that makes them so hard to read and so instructive. He is more articulate about his own failure than any critic could be. Read them alongside almost any modern account of somebody in difficulty, and the difference is startling. There is no minimizing. No, it was not that much. No, I can stop whenever. He calls himself contemptible, a beast, unworthy, a scoundrel, in language that would be actionable coming from anybody else. And it changes nothing. Not once. He writes the most severe possible account of his own behaviour, and then, in the same letter, asks for 50 roubles, which is the single most useful thing in this correspondence, and it is the finding the second half of tonight will confirm with data. Self-condemnation is not a corrective. It is not the beginning of change, and it is not evidence of seriousness. It is, if anything, part of the mechanism. It discharges some of the pressure, it performs the remorse the situation seems to require, and it leaves the underlying arrangement completely untouched. If you have been assuming that you are not yet sorry enough for something to stop doing it, that assumption is exactly backwards, and there is a man with 100 surviving letters proving it. Chapter 14. What she did not do and what she wrote. Start with the negative because it is more surprising than the positive. She did not reproach him, not once, in any surviving document in 4 years. She did not threaten to leave. She did not use the child as leverage. She did not make her affection conditional on his stopping. She did not deliver ultimatums. She did not, so far as the record shows, ever say the sentence that any of us would have said, which is, if you do this again, that is the end. And she did not try to stop him going. That last one is the one that will make some listeners genuinely angry, and I understand why, and I want to give it its full weight before I explain it. There were times when she gave him the money to go and play, knowing exactly what would happen. There were times when she pawned her own things to do it. By any modern account of what a person should do in that situation, that is enabling, and it is the thing every service in the world would tell you not to do. I am not going to argue that she was right. I am going to tell you what she wrote about why, and then what the research says, and let you sit with the fact that they agree, which is not what I expected when I started reading about this. Her account is direct. She said that she had learned early that opposing him made it worse, that when she resisted or argued or refused, the episodes were longer and the recovery from them was harder, and he became more agitated and went anyway. And that when she agreed calmly and without drama, the whole thing ran a shorter course. She also said something more interesting, and it is the thing I would underline. She said she understood that this was an illness and not a moral failing, and that she therefore did not take it personally. That is a remarkable sentence to be written by a woman with no education in psychology in the 1860s, decades before anybody had a framework for it. Every contemporary of hers would have called it vice. She looked at it and concluded it was more like a fever and behaved accordingly. And the practical consequence of that is the whole thing. If it is a moral failing, then the correct response is pressure, shame, and consequence. If it is closer to an illness, then pressure and shame are not medicine, and all they do is add a second problem to the first. She removed the shame. There is a version of what she did that is worth translating into ordinary terms, because most people listening are not married to a gambler, and this generalizes further than it looks. She refused to be the second voice. He already had a voice telling him he was contemptible. It was his own, it was extremely fluent, and it ran constantly. There was no shortage of condemnation in that marriage, and she could see there was no shortage. So, when the letter arrived saying, "I am a beast," she did not agree and she did not argue. She answered the practical part. That is a genuinely difficult thing to do, and it is not the same as being nice. She was not soothing him. She was declining to add a second copy of a signal that was already at full volume, on the grounds that the first copy was demonstrably not working, and a second one was unlikely to help. Anybody who lives with somebody who is failing at something has this choice available roughly weekly. The instinct is to make sure they understand the seriousness. And the person almost always understands the seriousness better than you do, and what your version adds is not information, it is only volume. Chapter 15, Geneva and the Last Time. I have to put this in, and I am going to do it briefly and carefully because it is the darkest part of those 4 years, and it is not the subject of tonight. Their first child, a daughter, was born in Geneva on the 5th of March 1868. They named her Sophia and called her Sonia. She died 3 months later on the 12th of May. He was destroyed by it. The letters from that period are hard to read. He wrote about her small habits, the way she had begun to look at him, that she had known him. I am not going to make anything of it, or use it, or draw a lesson from it. It is simply true, and it happened in the middle of the worst of the gambling, and any account of those years that leaves it out is describing a man with a hole in the middle of him and not saying so. They had 3 more children: Lyubov, born the following year, Fyodor in 1871, and a son, Alexei, born in 1875, who died at the age of 2.5 in 1878, which is another story for another night and a heavier one than this. April 1871, Wiesbaden, where it had started 9 years earlier. They were in Dresden. She was pregnant with their second surviving child. He went to Wiesbaden and did what he always did, and lost and pawned and lost again. And then something happened that he described in a letter to her the same day, and the letter survives, and it is the most extraordinary document in this whole story. He wrote that a great thing had happened to him, that the vile fantasy which had tormented him for almost 10 years had vanished, that he had always dreamed of winning, and had dreamed of it seriously, passionately, and that now it was finished, that this had been the last time, and that she would see that he was now a different man. Men write letters like that. That is not the remarkable part. He had written letters approximately like that before. The remarkable part is that it was true. He lived another 10 years. He never gambled again. I want to be careful about that afternoon in Wiesbaden, because it is the point at which this story is most likely to be told badly. The tempting version is that he had a spiritual experience and was released. The evidence does not support that, and he did not quite claim it. What the letter says is that a fantasy which had tormented him for almost 10 years had gone. It reports a change of state. It does not report a revelation, and the business about the synagogue is one sentence in a long letter and is not presented as causal. And there were surrounding conditions, all of which are documented and none of which are mystical. They were weeks away from ending 4 years abroad and going home. He had a small child and another coming. He was, at 49, in visibly worse health than he had been at 45. The 4-year experiment of living cheaply in Europe had comprehensively failed on its own terms. And within a very short time, the tables he had been playing at ceased to exist, because gambling was outlawed across the newly unified Germany and the spa casinos closed. I am not saying the afternoon did not happen or did not matter. I am saying that a decade-long behaviour ending permanently on one afternoon is the kind of claim that usually turns out, on inspection, to have a great deal of ordinary structural change underneath it. That is not a deflation. It is considerably more useful than a miracle, because structural change is something a person can arrange. Chapter 16. What actually happened that day and the part nobody tells you. Nobody knows, and I want to say that clearly rather than construct a tidy explanation. There is an account which comes from him of that afternoon, that after losing he went looking for a priest in a foreign town, meaning to confess, and became lost in the streets, and went into a building he took to be a church, and found that he had walked into a synagogue, and that he came out of it and went back to the hotel, and it was over. Take that for what it is. It is one man's account of his own turning point given afterwards, and turning points are exactly the thing people reconstruct. What we can say with more confidence is what the surrounding conditions were, because those are documented. They were about to go home. The 4 years abroad were ending. They returned to Russia within weeks, in July 1871. His circumstances were changing in several ways at once. He had a child and another arriving. And the specific environment in which the behaviour lived, which was the German spa towns with their casinos, was about to be permanently removed, because the tables he played at were in fact shut down by law shortly afterwards, when gambling was banned in the newly unified Germany. Hold that thought about environment. It matters more than it looks, and we will come back to it with evidence. Now the ending that is genuinely the best thing in this story, and which almost no version includes because it is about administration. They came home to Russia in 1871, and they were still in debt, enormously. The creditors were still there, and some of them were the ones he had inherited from his brother 7 years earlier. And Anna, who had been a stenographer and was now 25, looked at the situation and made a diagnosis that nobody else had made. The problem was not that he did not earn, he earned well. The problem was the structure. He was paid advances by publishers, in lumps, against work not yet done, at terrible rates, because he always needed money now, which meant he was permanently selling his future cheaply to pay for his past. So in 1873, she did something no writer's wife in Russia had done. She published his next novel herself. She learned the trade from the ground. She found out how paper was bought and what it cost. She dealt with the printer directly. She worked out the discount structure for booksellers and refused the standard one. She handled the advertising, the accounts, the distribution, and the correspondence. She did not use a publisher at all. The book was the devil's. It sold out. She kept the entire margin that a publisher would have taken. And from that point on, she published him, ran the business, controlled the money, and paid the debts down methodically. Within a few years, the debts were gone. By the end of his life, the household was comfortable, and after his death, she continued to publish him and did so extremely successfully for decades. There is a detail about her publishing operation that deserves its own moment, because it is the part that actually paid the debts, and nobody ever mentions it. She refused the standard bookseller discount. The trade at that time worked on terms that heavily favored the middlemen, and everybody accepted them because everybody accepted them. She worked out what the real numbers were, decided the terms were bad, and simply declined, selling direct where she could and negotiating individually where she could not. Booksellers told her she would fail. She did not. That is, a 26-year-old with no commercial training and no capital in 1873 in a business she had learned from scratch, refusing an industry norm on the basis of arithmetic. And the reason it worked is the reason such things usually work. She had actually done the sums, and almost nobody else in the transaction had, because the terms were traditional, and traditions do not get audited. It is worth asking, at 1 a.m, whether any of the terms you are currently operating under are traditional rather than calculated. Most people are carrying at least one arrangement they have never actually costed, accepted years ago because it was what was offered, and never revisited. Chapter 17. What she actually did and the last decade. Look at what changed, because it was not his character. He did not become disciplined. There is no evidence that he acquired willpower in 1871 that he had lacked in 1870. What changed was that he stopped being the person holding the money. The mechanism that had driven 10 years of it was structural. A permanent state of being behind, a man with access to whatever cash existed, and a belief that one large correction could fix it. Anna removed 2 of those 3. She fixed the being behind slowly, with a spreadsheet in her head, and she took the cash out of his hands entirely. She did not change his mind about roulette. She changed his relationship to money so that the question stopped arising. Now, if you have been listening carefully, you will notice that the 2 halves of what she did look contradictory. During the 4 years, she gave him money without argument. Afterwards, she controlled every rouble. They are not contradictory. They are the same principle applied to different situations. And the principle is, work on the machinery, never on the man. While he was in it, the machinery said that shame would make it worse, so she withheld shame. When the situation changed, the machinery said that access was the driver, so she removed access. At no point did she try to make him better by making him feel worse. The 10 years after 1871 were the best of his working life. The Devils. Then A Writer's Diary, which was a monthly, one-man publication that he wrote entirely himself, and which became enormously popular, and which put him in a position no Russian writer had occupied before. Then, The Brothers Karamazov, finished in November 1880. In June 1880, he gave a speech at the unveiling of a monument to Pushkin in Moscow, and the accounts of it are almost comic in their intensity. People wept, embraced strangers, and one man is reported to have fainted. It was the high point of his public life. He died on the 28th of January, 1881, at 59, of a pulmonary hemorrhage, 2 months after finishing the novel. The crowd at his funeral was very large. The estimates vary wildly, and I will not pretend to a number, but every account agrees that the streets were full. Anna was 34. She never remarried. She spent the next 37 years on his work, publishing it, compiling the first bibliography of it, collecting the manuscripts and letters, founding a museum room, and writing her memoir. She died in 1918 in the middle of the Civil War in Yalta. She had been his stenographer for 26 days, and his wife for 14 years, and his publisher for 45. And it is worth saying what those last 10 years actually contained, because the shape of it matters. He did not get a fresh start. He got the same life with the arithmetic fixed. The epilepsy did not improve. The health got worse. The political trouble did not go away. He remained under police supervision for years. He still worked to deadlines, still wrote at speed, still had months when nothing came. What changed was that the money stopped being an emergency. That is the entire difference between the 4 years abroad and the 10 years at home, and it produced the brothers Karamazov. There is a version of adult life in which people wait for a transformation and get, at best, a change of conditions, and are disappointed because they were expecting the other thing. The change of conditions is the thing. It is what is actually available. It is what actually produces the good decade. And it looks like nothing from outside, because there is no moment to point at. There is only a household where the letters from creditors stopped arriving, and a man who could therefore work. Chapter 18. The most persistent behaviour ever measured. That is the story. From here, we look at what is actually known, and I want to start with the thing that explains why this particular pattern is so stubborn. Because once you see it, a great deal of your own behaviour becomes legible and stops being embarrassing. It has nothing to do with gambling specifically. It is a finding about how any animal, including you, responds to rewards that arrive unpredictably. In the 1950s, B.F. Skinner and Charles Foerster ran an exhaustive program of experiments on what they called schedules of reinforcement. The question was simple. If you want a behavior to persist, how should the reward be delivered? They tested the obvious ones. Reward every time, reward every fifth time, reward every 30 seconds. And they tested the unobvious one. Reward on average every so often, but at unpredictable intervals, so the subject never knows which attempt will pay. That last one is called a variable ratio schedule, and it produces the highest and steadiest rates of responding of any schedule they tested. And here is the finding that matters for tonight. It also produces the greatest resistance to extinction, which means when you stop rewarding it altogether, the behavior continues for far longer than under any other schedule. Think about why that is, because it is almost beautiful in its cruelty. Under a predictable schedule, absence of reward is information. If you are paid every fifth time, and the fifth time comes and nothing happens, something has changed. Under an unpredictable schedule, absence of reward is not information, it is normal. A long run of nothing is exactly what the schedule looks like from inside. There is no length of failure that constitutes evidence, because you have already survived runs like this and been paid at the end of them. That is not a metaphor for gambling. It is the literal mechanism of a roulette wheel, of a slot machine, of a phone that sometimes has something on it, of a person who is sometimes warm to you, of a business that occasionally has a good month. You cannot reason your way out of a variable ratio schedule, because the schedule has removed the evidence that reasoning would need. It is worth being clear about why this finding is so much more useful than it first appears, because on a first hearing it sounds like a fact about pigeons. The schedule is everywhere. Any process that pays off unpredictably has this structure, and once you start looking, you will find you are standing in front of several of them. The phone, which sometimes has something on it. The job application process, which occasionally responds. The relationship in which affection arrives at unpredictable intervals, which is the cruelest version and the one that produces the most durable attachment. The business that has a good month about twice a year, the parent whose approval was available sometimes and never reliably. Every one of those is a variable schedule, and every one of them produces the same signature: high, steady effort and extraordinary resistance to giving up. And the reason giving up is so hard is not that you are hoping, it is that the schedule has removed the evidence that would let you stop hoping. A long run of nothing is not a signal under this arrangement. It is what the arrangement looks like from inside. So if you have been unable to walk away from something and have concluded that this is a defect in you, the honest reading is that you are standing in front of a machine engineered, whether deliberately or by accident, to be very difficult to walk away from, using the equipment everybody has. Chapter 19. The illusion of control. The second piece is why the person believes they can influence it. In 1975, Ellen Langer published a set of experiments under the title The Illusion of Control. And the design is very simple and very devastating. She ran lottery-style setups where the outcome was purely random, and varied small features that in a skill task would matter, but in a chance task cannot. Whether the participant chose their own ticket or was handed one, whether the ticket was a familiar object or an unfamiliar one, whether there was competition, whether they had a chance to practice or to think about it first. Every one of those manipulations increased people's confidence and their valuation of their own ticket in a game with no skill in it whatsoever. In one condition, people who had chosen their own ticket demanded roughly 4 times as much money to sell it back as people who had been handed one at random. Langer's conclusion is that we carry a set of cues that in ordinary life reliably indicate skill situations, and those cues fire automatically whenever they are present, regardless of whether skill is actually involved. Choice, familiarity, effort, practice, concentration present those in a chance task, and the sense of control appears anyway, uninvited. Now put Dostoevsky's system next to that. His entire theory was that the determining factor was concentration and self-command. He had built in words precisely the illusion Langer demonstrated in a laboratory a century later, and he had built it out of exactly the cues she identified. He was not a fool. He was a normally constructed human being operating the standard equipment in the one environment where it is guaranteed to be wrong. There is a second half to Langer's work that is less quoted and more useful. She found that the illusion is strongest exactly where it is most expensive. In situations that combine genuine skill elements with genuine chance elements. Pure chance, clearly labelled, most people handle reasonably well. Nobody has a system for a coin toss. But mix the two, so that effort and attention really do matter to part of the outcome and not at all to the rest, and people become unable to tell which part they are in. They attribute the whole result to the part they can influence, because that is the part they can see themselves doing. That describes an enormous amount of adult life: business, investing, applications, dating, careers. In every one of them, skill genuinely matters and luck genuinely dominates, and the human instrument is not equipped to tell you the ratio, which produces 2 errors, and most people only ever hear about one. The first is taking too much credit when it goes well, which is the one everybody warns about. The second is taking too much blame when it does not, and at 1 in the morning, that is the one operating. You are going back through a decade of outcomes, assigning them all to your own conduct, in a domain where the ratio of skill to chance is unknown and probably unfavorable. You did not have that much control. That is not an excuse. It is an accuracy correction, and it runs in both directions. One further detail from that literature, because it is the one that generalizes furthest. Involvement increases the illusion. The more of yourself you put into something, the more control you believe you have over its outcome, regardless of whether the effort touches the mechanism at all. Time spent, attention paid, care taken, thought given, all of it raises confidence. None of it necessarily raises the odds, which explains a specific and very common kind of pain. The people most confident they can rescue a failing thing are usually the people who have put the most into it, and their confidence is a measure of their investment rather than of the situation. Chapter 20. The fallacy with his name on it. There is a specific error that follows from all this, and it is so common it has a name. The gambler's fallacy is the belief that independent events somehow keep accounts, that after a long run of red, black is due, that after a bad stretch, things must turn. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman described the underlying mistake in 1971 in a paper about what they called belief in the law of small numbers. The finding is that people expect short sequences to look like the long-run average. We know that over 10,000 spins the reds and blacks even out, and we wrongly expect that to be true over 10. It is not. The wheel has no memory. It cannot know what it has done. Each spin is the first spin. The most quoted illustration is a night at Monte Carlo in 1913, when the ball landed on black an extraordinary number of times in a row. As the run continued, players bet increasingly heavily on red, on the reasoning that it must be coming. Millions were lost. The run had no obligation to end, and the wheel was not aware that anything unusual was occurring. And notice where this bites hardest. It is not at the table. It is in ordinary life. In the sentence, "I am due some good luck." That sentence feels like realism. It is the gambler's fallacy applied to a life. Nothing is owed to you by the sequence. A run of bad years does not increase the probability of a good one, and believing that it does is the mechanism by which people stay in a losing position, waiting for a correction that is not coming. I am aware that is a bleak paragraph at 1 in the morning. Stay with me, because the practical consequence of it is actually liberating, and we will get there. There is a mirror image error that costs people at least as much and has no name in the popular vocabulary. The gambler's fallacy says a run must end. The hot hand belief says a run must continue. They are logically opposite, and they coexist happily in the same person, often in the same evening, and which one fires depends on nothing more principled than whether the run has been going your way. Losing streak, it is due to turn. Winning streak, I am on form. This is my night. Both conclusions come from the same underlying mistake, which is treating a sequence of independent events as though it had a memory and a direction. And because the two are opposite, no outcome can ever disconfirm the pair. Whatever happens, one of them fits. That is worth watching for in yourself at this hour, because it is not really about tables at all. It is about how you are reading the last 3 years of your life. A run of bad ones is not evidence that a good one is owed. A run of good ones is not evidence that you have worked something out. The sequence does not know what it has done, and it does not owe you a correction. There is a small mercy hidden in all this, and it is worth extracting before we move on. If the sequence has no memory, then it also holds nothing against you. The run of bad years is not a judgment, and it is not a correction for something earlier, and it is not the universe balancing an account. Those readings feel like meaning, and they are all versions of the same error we have just taken apart. It was a sequence. It did not know what it was doing. It is not aimed at you, and it is not owed to you, and it does not have a plan for you. At 3 in the morning, that can sound bleak. Turn it over, and it is the opposite. Nothing is being extracted from you, and there is no debt being collected. Chapter 21. The Near Miss. Now, the finding that I think is the single most useful thing in the second half of tonight. In 2009, Luke Clark and colleagues published a study in the journal Neuron using brain imaging on ordinary volunteers, not addicts, playing a simple slot machine task. They were interested in a specific event, the near miss, the outcome where the symbols line up one position off, the bar that stops just past, the 2 out of 3. A near miss is, objectively, a loss. You have exactly the same amount of money as if the symbols had been nowhere near each other. What they found is that near misses recruited the same reward-related brain circuitry that actual wins did, at reduced but real levels. And, in the behavioral measure, near misses increased the participants' desire to continue playing relative to full misses. Read that again, because it is the whole trap in one sentence. A near miss is a loss that your brain files as a win. And because it is filed as a win, it functions as reinforcement. Which means the machine can reward you without paying you. Which means the schedule of reinforcement is far denser than the schedule of payment, and the two have come apart. Now take it out of the casino, because this is not really about casinos. The job that almost turned the corner this quarter, the relationship that was almost right for a while there, the business that nearly worked in 2019, the conversation that nearly went well, every one of those is a near miss, and your brain has been filing them as partial wins for years, which is why the situation has felt like it is going somewhere while producing nothing. That is not you being deluded. That is a piece of machinery doing exactly what it was built to do in an environment it was not built for. There is a design consequence of the near-miss finding that is worth knowing about, because it changes how you read the machines around you. Once you know that near misses reinforce, you can engineer them, and the industry did. Modern slot machines are built so that the reels stop in ways that produce near misses far more often than random arrangement would, within limits set by regulators in various jurisdictions and disputed in others. The near-miss rate is a design parameter. Roulette in 1865 had no such engineering. The near misses he experienced were simply what a wheel produces. But the effect on him was the same, because the effect is in the player, not the machine. Which is why I want to broaden it before we move on. You are almost certainly running a near-miss ledger about something, and you have almost certainly been counting the entries as progress. The role you nearly got. The year the business almost turned. The stretch when the relationship was nearly right. The conversation that almost went well. Every one of those has been reinforcing continuation, and none of them paid anything. If you added up the last 5 years and separated the things that actually happened from the things that nearly happened, the shape of the situation would change substantially, and it is not a calculation anybody does voluntarily. I am not going to ask you to do it tonight, only to notice that the ledger exists and that the near misses are in it under the wrong heading. There is one further thing about near misses that is worth knowing, because it explains a piece of behaviour that looks irrational and is not. The effect is strongest when the near miss is under your apparent control. If the symbols stop one place short after you press the button, the effect is large. If the same outcome is produced by a machine that plays itself while you watch, the effect is much smaller. Which means the sense of having almost done it is doing the work, not the almost by itself. It is not, I nearly won, it is, I nearly did it. That is why the near-miss ledger is so hard to discount in ordinary life. Every entry in it is filed not as a thing that nearly happened, but as a thing you nearly achieved, and discounting it feels like discounting yourself. Chapter 22. Chasing. The clinical literature has a word for the thing that separates a person who has a flutter from a person who is in trouble, and the word is not amount, it is chasing. Henry Lesueur's 1977 study of the careers of compulsive gamblers is titled The Chase, and the finding is that the defining feature is not how much is staked or how often, it is the return to recoup, playing to get back what was lost rather than playing for the thing itself. Chasing changes the entire structure of the activity. It converts a leisure behaviour, which has a natural stopping point when the money set aside is gone, into a repair behaviour which has no stopping point at all because the losses grow faster than any recovery. Chasing is now written into the diagnostic criteria. After losing money, often returns another day to get even. And the reason I'm spending time on it is that the concept generalizes further and more usefully than almost anything else in this literature. Chasing is what you are doing when you stay another 2 years in the job because of the 11 already in it. Chasing is what you are doing when you go back to the person because of what you have already invested. Chasing is the second decade of a thing that stopped working in the first. The line is not how much it costs. The line is whether the reason you are still doing it is the thing itself, or what you have already lost. That is a question you can actually ask yourself tonight about the thing you are lying there thinking about, and the answer arrives quite fast. It is worth sitting with the definition a little longer, because chasing is the single most transferable idea in tonight's second half. Chasing changes what the activity is for. Before chasing, the activity has a purpose of its own. You do it because you like it, or because it pays, or because it is interesting. It has a natural stopping point, because when the enjoyment is finished or the money set aside is gone, there is no further reason to continue. After chasing, the activity exists to repair the damage caused by the activity. And that has no stopping point at all, because the repair is never complete and each attempt at it enlarges the thing being repaired. Two behaviours, identical from outside, completely different from inside, and the difference is not measurable in hours or in money. It is only visible in the answer to one question: what is this for now? And the reason it matters is that the question is answerable. Most of the diagnostics people try to run on themselves at 1 in the morning are unanswerable, which is why they take all night. This one takes about 8 seconds. Am I still doing this for the thing itself, or to get back what it has already taken? You know which. Everybody always knows which. And there is one more property of chasing that makes it particularly hard to see from inside. It disguises itself as responsibility. The person chasing does not experience themselves as reckless. They experience themselves as trying to put something right, which is a virtue and which feels like the opposite of self-indulgence. Walking away would feel like abandoning the debt, and abandoning a debt feels like a failure of character. So the behaviour recruits your conscience to keep it running. That is why telling somebody in this position to stop being irresponsible lands so badly. From inside, stopping is the irresponsible option. It is the one that makes the loss final and admits that the time and money are simply gone. Chapter 23. Why him and not somebody else? The obvious question is why this happens to some people and not others, and the honest answer is that it is not one thing. The most useful framework is Alex Blazinski and Leonauer's Pathways model, published in 2002. Their argument is that treating problem gamblers as a single population is why the treatment literature was such a mess, because there are at least 3 fairly distinct routes in. The first pathway is essentially behavioral. Ordinary people, no particular vulnerability, who through exposure and conditioning and the distortions we have just described develop a problem. Take away the exposure and they generally do well. The second pathway is people who arrive already carrying something: depression, anxiety, a history of trauma, poor emotional regulation. For them, the behavior is doing a job. It is regulating a state. And that is why removing the behavior without addressing the state tends to fail, and why something else usually arrives to take its place. The third pathway involves impulsivity and antisocial features, and is the hardest to treat and the least relevant here. Dostoevsky maps onto the second one about as clearly as a historical figure can. He had epilepsy. He had a documented history of catastrophic loss, going back to a mock execution at 28 and 4 years in a prison camp. He had a temperament that everybody who met him remarked on, and the behavior ran hardest in periods of maximum pressure and grief. Which suggests, and this is speculation, but it is disciplined speculation, that the roulette was not primarily about money. It was a machine for producing an hour in which nothing existed except the next spin, and a man carrying what he was carrying may have found that hour very difficult to give up. There is an implication of the Pathways model that is worth drawing out, because it explains the most demoralizing experience in this whole area: substitution. People on the second pathway, the ones for whom the behavior is regulating a state, very often succeed in stopping and then find that something else has arrived to take the job. The drinking stops and the spending starts. The spending stops and the eating starts. The eating stops and the working starts. And working is socially rewarded, so nobody objects. And the underlying state is exactly where it was. That is not failure, and it is not weakness, and it is a completely predictable consequence of removing a regulator without addressing what it was regulating. Which is why the useful question is not, how do I stop? It is, what is this hour doing for me? If the honest answer is that it is the only part of the week in which the running commentary goes quiet, then removing it without replacing that silence is not a plan. Something will arrive to fill the vacancy, and it is rarely an improvement, and you will have spent the intervening months believing you were doing well. Anything that goes in its place has to do the same job. Quieter, cheaper, and less destructive, but the same job. It is worth adding what the pathways model implies about advice, because it explains why most of it fails. Different pathways need different things, and the standard advice is written for the first one. Remove the exposure, install some barriers, understand the odds. That works reasonably well for somebody who arrived through conditioning and has nothing underneath it. It is close to useless for somebody whose behaviour is doing a job, because they will simply find another way to do the job. Which means the most important question is not how bad is it? It is what is it for? And that question is not answerable by anybody except the person in it, which is one of the reasons this is such a lonely problem and such a difficult one to help with from outside. It is worth adding one honest caveat to the whole pathways framework. It is a model, not a measurement. People do not arrive with a label on them. The boundaries between the three are blurred, and a fair number of people look like more than one depending on the year. Its value is not diagnostic precision. Its value is that it stopped the field asking a single question about a single population and getting mixed answers, which is what had been happening for 30 years. That is worth knowing for its own sake, because the same error is very common in how people think about themselves, assuming that there is one explanation for a behaviour and that the right one will account for all of it, when in practice, most persistent behaviour has several causes running at once, and each needs a different lever. Chapter 24. The explanation that cannot be wrong. There is a famous account of all this that I am going to give a fair hearing and then decline, because how we decline it matters more than the fact of declining it. In 1928, Freud published an essay called Dostoevsky and Parricide. Its argument, briefly, is that Dostoevsky had unconsciously wished for his father's death, that when his father did die, the guilt was unbearable, that the epilepsy was not organic, but a hysterical self-punishment, and that the gambling was the same mechanism, a compulsion to lose in order to be punished. It is elegant, it explains everything, and it has one large problem. The load-bearing claim is that the seizures began after the father's death. The documentary record does not support that, and the timeline Freud relied on has not held up. Modern medical and biographical work treats his epilepsy as an organic condition. But I want to make the point about method rather than about Freud, because it is the transferable part. Notice the structure of the theory. If he lost, that proves the compulsion to be punished. If he won, that would prove he was staving off the punishment. If he stopped, that proves the guilt was discharged. There is no possible observation that could count against it. A theory that cannot be wrong is not a strong theory. It is a theory that has stopped making contact with the world. And you run these at 1 in the morning, constantly, I am like this because of how I was raised. I always do this. This is just who I am. Every one of those has the same structure. It explains every past instance, predicts nothing, cannot be tested, and cannot be escaped, because any counterexample gets absorbed as an exception. If a sentence about yourself explains everything you have ever done and could not be disproved by anything you might do tomorrow, it is not an insight. It is a cage with a plausible shape. There is a general test hiding in that chapter which is worth extracting, because you will need it at 3 a.m. more than you will need anything about Freud. Ask what would have to be true for the explanation to be wrong. If you can answer that, the explanation is doing work. It is making a claim about the world, and the world could, in principle, contradict it, and that is what an explanation is. If you cannot answer it, you are not holding an explanation. You are holding a shape that fits any data, and it will keep fitting forever, and no amount of thinking will get you out of it because there is no exit built in. Now run that on the sentences your own mind produces at this hour. I always ruin things. What would falsify that? Nothing. Every good outcome becomes an exception, and every bad one becomes proof. I am fundamentally lazy. What would falsify that? Nothing. The productive years get reclassified as luck or as fear. They never really cared. What would falsify that? Nothing. Every kindness gets reread as obligation. Each of those feels like a hard-won insight, and each is unfalsifiable, which means each will run for as long as you leave it running. That is not a reason to believe the opposite. It is a reason to notice that you are not currently thinking, and that continuing will not produce an answer, because the question was built without one. Chapter 25. What actually predicts stopping? So, what does the evidence say helps? I want to give you the honest version, which is less satisfying than the version in a film and considerably more useful. The first finding is that a great many people stop without any treatment at all. The natural recovery literature on addictive behaviours consistently finds that a substantial proportion resolve on their own, often after a change in circumstances rather than after a decision. That is not an argument against getting help. It is an argument against the belief that a person who has not been rescued is doomed. The second finding is that what precedes unassisted change is very often a change in the environment or the role, rather than a change in resolve. A move, a new job, a child, a relationship, a physical relocation away from where the behavior lives. The third finding is the one that runs against intuition, and it is the one Anna arrived at by herself. Shame does not reduce the behavior. It reliably predicts worse outcomes. The work on shame and guilt, most associated with June Tangney, draws a distinction that is worth memorizing because it is one of the most practically useful distinctions in all of psychology. Guilt is about the act. I did a bad thing. It is uncomfortable, it is oriented toward repair, and it is associated with better outcomes: apology, restitution, change. Shame is about the self. I am a bad thing. It is not oriented toward repair, because there is nothing to repair. The problem is you. Shame is associated with concealment, with withdrawal, with defensiveness, and with continuation. And there is a specific vicious circuit in the addiction literature. Shame leads to concealment. Concealment prevents help, and the distress of the shame is itself relieved by the behaviour. So the shame feeds the thing it is a response to, which means that every time somebody tells a person in this position that they should be ashamed of themselves, they are administering the accelerant. There is a practical version of this distinction that is worth carrying, because it survives being applied to yourself at 1 a.m, which most psychology does not. Listen to the grammar of the sentence in your head. If the sentence has a verb in it, it is guilt, and guilt is workable. I did that. I said that. I spent that. A sentence with a verb has an object and a time and usually a next action. If the sentence has only a noun, it is shame, and shame is not workable. I am selfish, I am weak, I am the sort of person who does this. There is no verb, so there is nothing that was done, so there is nothing that can be done about it. That is not a trick to make yourself feel better, it is a diagnostic. When you notice the sentence has lost its verb, you have moved from the material to the character, and the character version has no exit, which is precisely why it can run until 4. Anna's letters back to him do this instinctively. He writes to her that he is contemptible, a beast, worthless, all nouns. She replies about the practical situation. She does not argue with the nouns and she does not agree with them. She simply declines to operate at that level and answers the verb instead. There is one more finding in this area that belongs here, and it is the one I would most like people to know because it contradicts something almost everybody believes. Willpower is not the mechanism in the successful cases. When researchers interview people who have stopped something durably, the accounts very rarely feature a heroic act of restraint. What they feature is a change in the surrounding facts. A move, a job, an illness, a birth, a new relationship, a friend who intervened, a rule that made access difficult. And when people fail, the accounts very often feature exactly the strategy everybody recommends. Trying harder, being more determined, resolving more sincerely. The reason is not mysterious. Resolve is a state, and states fluctuate, and the behaviour only needs one bad evening. A structural change is a fact, and facts hold while you are tired. That is the actual finding, and it is not a comfortable one, because structural changes are inconvenient and resolutions are free. But it is the reason a man who resolved 100 times in writing in the most eloquent language available in 19th century Russian stopped only when he left the continent and his wife took control of the money. Chapter 26. Anna in modern language. Now go back and look at what she did with all that in hand. She removed the shame, not the accountability and not the reality, but the shame specifically. He wrote her letters calling himself contemptible, and she wrote back without agreeing. She refused to be the second voice. She kept the relationship non-contingent. He never had to earn her by stopping, which meant that failing did not also cost him her, which meant that failing did not have to be hidden, which meant she always knew where he was and how bad it was. Every one of those follows from the first. She treated it as a condition rather than a defect, which is what the field arrived at a century later. She changed the environment rather than arguing with the man. they left Europe. The tables were physically no longer available. And she restructured the money, which is the piece that produced the durable result, because the thing driving the whole system was the permanent state of being behind, and she is the one who ended it, with arithmetic, over several years. Not one of those is willpower, not one of them is confrontation, not one of them is an ultimatum. And I want to say clearly, because it matters, none of this means a person should tolerate anything. She was not passive, and she did not sacrifice herself. She took control of every practical lever there was, and she used them all. The lever she declined to use was the only one that does not work. It is worth saying clearly what she was not doing, because there is a bad reading of this available, and I do not want to leave it lying around. She was not tolerating it. She was not being endlessly patient, or turning the other cheek, or loving him better than he deserved. Those are the readings that make her a saint and the story useless. She took every practical lever there was, and she used all of them. She controlled the money as soon as she could. She got them out of the country where the tables were. She learned a trade and ran a business and removed the financial pressure that was driving the whole system. She kept records. She was, in the end, in charge. The one lever she declined to use was shame, and she declined it not out of gentleness, but because she had watched it fail repeatedly and had noticed that the episodes were longer when she reproached him and shorter when she did not. That is not saintliness. That is somebody running an experiment on a difficult situation and following the result, even though the result was counterintuitive and probably galling. If there is a model in this story for anybody living with somebody else's problem, it is that. Use every practical lever and drop the one that has been measured and does not work, however satisfying it would be to use it. There is one more thing she did that goes almost entirely unremarked, and it is the hardest of all of them. She did not make his stopping the condition of the marriage, which sounds like weakness and is in fact the thing that made accurate information available. Because the moment stopping becomes the condition of the relationship, the incentive to conceal becomes overwhelming, and concealment is the state in which nothing can be fixed. He told her everything, every time, immediately, for 4 years. That was possible only because telling her cost him nothing except his own shame. Whatever else that arrangement was, it kept the channel open, and the channel was the thing that eventually carried the solution. Chapter 27. The 9 years he did not lose. Before we come back to you, one last look at the 26 days, because there is something in them that is easy to miss. He did not solve that problem by being brilliant. He solved it by accepting a technology he did not like from a friend at the last possible moment, on the advice of somebody who knew how a receipt works. Every part of the rescue was external. The suggestion was Miliukov's. The skill was Anna's. The legal maneuver was Anna's. The only thing he contributed was the willingness to try a method he had spent his whole career not using, and the refusal to let his friends write it for him. That is what being saved actually looks like. Not a resolution, a specific person, arriving with a specific piece of practical knowledge on a specific Tuesday, and the willingness to accept it. And it is worth noticing what he would have had to do to prevent it. All he needed to do was be too proud to accept a stenographer. That is all. He would have lost 9 years of his own work over a preference about how he liked to write. The person who ends up on the wrong side of this is very rarely the person with worse problems. It is the person who could not accept the help when it arrived in an unfamiliar shape. There is a small detail in the rescue that I want to hold up, because it is the part most likely to be relevant to you. Milyukov's idea was not brilliant. Hire a stenographer is not an insight. It required no understanding of Dostoevsky's psychology, no literary judgment, no special sympathy. It was a practical suggestion of the kind that occurs to somebody standing slightly outside a problem, and it saved 9 years of the man's working life. That is very often the shape of it. The thing that unlocks a situation somebody has been stuck in for a year is almost never a deep observation about their character. It is a mundane operational suggestion from somebody who is not inside it and can therefore see that the difficulty is procedural rather than personal, which has 2 consequences worth carrying. If you are stuck, the thing you need may not be insight, and you may have been looking for the wrong kind of help. Describe the mechanics of the problem out loud to somebody uninvolved, and see what they say. It is frequently embarrassing how quickly it comes. And if somebody you know is stuck, you do not need to understand them. You need to listen to the mechanics and say the obvious practical thing, and be willing to be told it is not that simple. Because sometimes it is that simple and nobody in the room could see it. It is worth noting how little of the rescue was inspired. Everything in it was ordinary competence applied at the right moment. A friend who knew a practical fact. A young woman who was good at a technical skill and turned up when she said she would. A piece of legal common sense about where to deposit a document. None of it required genius, and none of it required love. I find that steadying rather than deflating. It means that the sort of help that actually rescues people is help that ordinary people can give on an ordinary day, without understanding the situation deeply or caring about it enormously. You have almost certainly been that person for somebody without ever knowing it. And it is worth noticing what the friend did not do. Milyukov did not sit him down and talk about why he gambled. He did not offer to lend him money. He did not tell him he was worried about him, or ask how he was really feeling, or suggest that this pattern went back to something. He looked at the mechanics of an impossible deadline and made an operational suggestion. That is a specific kind of friendship that gets very little credit and does an enormous amount of work in the world. The person who declines the emotional conversation and solves the logistics instead. Both kinds are needed, but when there are 26 days left, only one of them is any use, and it is not usually the one people offer. Chapter 28. Whether it is a game? Now bring it home, because almost nobody listening to this has a roulette problem. Here is the transfer, and I want to make it precisely. Take the thing you have not been able to stop. It does not matter what it is. Ask 3 questions about it, in this order, and keep the answers concrete. First, is the reward unpredictable? Does it sometimes deliver and sometimes not, with no reliable pattern? If yes, then the reason you cannot let go of it is not weakness. It is the most persistent reinforcement schedule ever measured, and no amount of understanding will dissolve it. Second, Are you still in it for the thing or for what you have already put in? If the honest answer is the second one, you are chasing. And chasing is the one variable that reliably distinguishes a habit from a whole. Third, how much of what keeps it going is near misses? Count the times in the last 2 years that it almost worked. Those have been functioning as payments. They were not payments. 3 questions, all concrete, all answerable tonight, in under a minute, without any self-examination of the kind that keeps you awake. And there is a 4th question, which is optional, and which I offer carefully because it can be uncomfortable. What is the hour for? Not, what does it cost? And not, why do you do it? What does the hour itself contain? And what is absent from it? Because for a great many people, the answer, when they look at it honestly, is that the hour is the only part of the week in which the ordinary running commentary stops. The thing is absorbing. While it is happening, there is no room for the arithmetic, or the total, or the thing at work, or the conversation you have been avoiding. If that is what the hour is doing, then removing it without replacing it is not a plan. It is the removal of the only silence in the week, and something will arrive to occupy the vacancy, and it is rarely an improvement. Which is the honest reason the second pathway is the hard one. You are not removing a pleasure, you are removing a regulator, and the state it was regulating is still there afterwards, and now unattended. That is not an argument for continuing. It is an argument for expecting the vacancy, and for having something in mind for it that is not another machine. Let me add one more question to the 3, because it is the one that produces the most movement, and it is the least comfortable. Who knows the real number? Not roughly, not the version you have given people, the actual figure of money or hours or years or whatever the currency is. For most people carrying something, the honest answer is nobody. And that single fact is doing more work than any of the mechanisms we have discussed tonight. A problem that nobody else knows the size of cannot be worked on by anybody except the person hiding it. And that person has already demonstrated over a period of years that they cannot work on it alone. That is not a criticism, it is arithmetic. And here is the thing that makes this specific story worth 3 hours. He never had that problem. He could not conceal. He wrote it all down the same day in detail and posted it to the one person whose opinion he cared about every single time. It did not stop him. It stopped it becoming a secret, which is a different thing, and in the end, the thing that mattered. Because it meant the person who eventually solved it had accurate information to solve it with. One person, not everybody, one. Chapter 29. The one lever and what understanding is for. And if the answers come back badly, here is the only instruction I am going to give, because it is the only one the evidence really supports. Do not attack it with resolve. Change one structural thing. Anna did not talk him out of roulette. She got him out of the country and took the money. Structural means something that is true whether or not you feel strong on a given evening. Access changed. Location changed. Who holds the thing changed. A default changed. Something that has to be actively undone rather than merely resisted. Willpower is a state, and states fluctuate. Structure is a fact, and facts do not. You know already which one lever it is. Everybody does. It is the specific arrangement you have been carefully not changing. because changing it would make the thing genuinely difficult rather than theoretically difficult, and at some level you are not certain you want it to be genuinely difficult. I am not going to press on that. It is 1 a.m, and this is not the hour for decisions. I only want the thought placed somewhere you can find it in daylight. There is a fair objection to everything I have just said, and it is one he demonstrates better than anybody. He understood it completely. He wrote the definitive account of it, and he went back to the table for another 5 years. So what is the point of an evening like this? Here is what I think the point is, and it is smaller than insight and more valuable. Understanding does not stop the behaviour. What it does is stop the second layer. The behaviour costs you something. The second layer, which is the interpretation you place on it, costs you considerably more, and it is the one that keeps you awake. The behaviour costs money or time. The second layer costs you your account of who you are, and the second layer is the part that is wrong. You are not weak. You have been standing in front of a variable ratio schedule with an intact human reward system that files near misses as wins, chasing a total that was never going to be recovered, while being told by everybody, including yourself, that the solution is to try harder. Nothing about that requires a character flaw as an explanation. And removing the character flaw from the explanation does not excuse anything. It just takes away the fuel. There is a reason I am not going to press harder than that, and it is worth stating. Decisions made at this hour are bad decisions, and that is not a figure of speech. Fatigue narrows the number of options a mind can hold at once. Distress biases which memories are available. Darkness and silence remove the corrective signal you normally get from other people. And there is nothing you can actually do at 2 a.m, which means every conclusion arrives fully general, because there is no specific next action for it to attach to. So the resolutions formed now will be more extreme, more total, and more about your character than anything you would arrive at in daylight. And they will not survive contact with a Tuesday, and their failure to survive will then be added to the file as further evidence against you. That is the actual cost of deciding things at this hour, not the bad decision. The extra count of failure it generates a fortnight later. So, nothing tonight. Not as a comfort, but as a technical recommendation from the least reliable hour of the day. Chapter 30. When it is more than this, the necessary chapter, and I would rather say it plainly, there is a version of this that is not a habit, and is not something a recording can help with, and it is recognizable. If the amounts have grown, if you have borrowed to do it, or taken money that was for something else, or money that was not yours, if you have lied about it to somebody who would be hurt by it, if you have tried to stop and could not, more than once, if there is a person in your house who does not know the real figure, if thinking about the total produces anything at all, like the thought that they would be better off without you, that last one is the one I want to name directly. It is more common in this specific problem than in almost any other. It is a symptom rather than a conclusion, and it is not true. Under any of those, the next move is not a decision at 2 a.m. It is a phone call in daylight to a service in your own country, most of which are free and confidential, and have heard considerably worse than whatever you are about to tell them. And a doctor, if there is anything else underneath it, which there very often is, that is not defeat. Look at what actually happened in this story. The man did not get out by being strong. He got out because other people arrived with practical knowledge, and he let them. One more thing about asking for help, because there is a specific obstacle in this particular problem that is worth naming out loud. The shame is proportional to the amount, and the amount is exactly what you cannot say, which produces an impossible position. The thing that would have to be disclosed for anybody to help is the thing that feels most impossible to disclose. And the longer it goes on, the larger it gets, and the harder disclosure becomes. The problem grows in exactly the direction that seals the exit. Two things are worth knowing about that. The first is that the people who staff these services have heard larger numbers than yours. That is not a figure of speech either. It is what the job consists of. Whatever the figure is, it is somewhere in the middle of their week. The second is that the disclosure is not the treatment, it is the door. You do not have to arrive with a plan or an explanation or an account of how it got this bad. You have to say the number to one person whose job it is to hear numbers, and everything after that is somebody else's expertise. He never managed to ask anybody except his wife. She was enough in the end, but only because she happened to be extraordinary, and that is not a system anybody should have to rely on. And there is one specific thought I want to name directly, because it is more common in this particular problem than in almost any other. The thought that the people around you would be better off without you. It presents itself as arithmetic. It arrives with a total attached, and it feels like the honest conclusion of the total. It is not arithmetic. It is a symptom. It is well documented in exactly this situation, and it is wrong on its own terms. The debt does not go anywhere, and the people you are thinking of would trade every pound of it for the alternative without hesitating. If that is in the room tonight, it is a reason to talk to somebody tomorrow in daylight, and not a reason to keep doing sums. Chapter 31. The total again. Come back to the number your mind was assembling at the start of this. It is going to come back after this recording ends. Probably around 3. I would like you to have something ready for it. It is not that the number is wrong. It may well be right. It is that a total is a shape with no action attached, which is why it can run all night. It is designed, by the way your mind assembles it at this hour, to be unanswerable. The installment can be answered. The installment is a thing on a Tuesday. So, when the total arrives, do not argue with it and do not try to reduce it. Do one thing: convert it into the smallest installment you can name. Not the plan, not the solution. The one small, specific, concrete next thing, which will almost certainly be a phone call, or a sentence said out loud to one person, or a single arrangement changed. A total keeps you awake because there is nothing to do with it. An installment lets you sleep because it has a time attached, and the time is not now. There is a small technique attached to that which is worth having, and it takes about a minute. When the total arrives, do not argue with it. Do not try to reduce it, and do not go looking for evidence that it is smaller than it feels. That is a debate, and debates at this hour are lost by the person who is tired. Instead, convert it into the next installment, which means finishing this sentence. The smallest specific thing I could do about this on a weekday is not the plan, not the solution. The smallest specific thing, which will almost always be one of about 4 items, a phone call, a sentence said out loud to one person, one document looked at, or one arrangement changed. Then stop, because that is the whole exercise. The total keeps you awake because it has no action attached and therefore no terminating condition. The installment lets you sleep because it has a time attached and the time is not now. You are not solving anything by doing this. You are converting an unanswerable object into an answerable one and then putting it down until the answerable one can actually be done. There is a reason the installment works and the total does not, and it is not psychological trickery. An installment can be finished. That is the whole of it. A thing that can be completed produces, on completion, a small signal that says, "Done, stand down." A thing that cannot be completed produces no such signal, ever, which means the machinery keeps running because nothing has told it not to. You are not lying there because the problem is large. You are lying there because you have handed your mind an object with no completion condition, and it is doing what it is built to do with such an object, which is to keep going. There is a small physical component to this that is worth mentioning because it costs nothing. If the total has been running for more than about 20 minutes, get up. Not to do anything, not to solve it, just to be vertical in a different room for 5 minutes and then come back. The reason is unglamorous. The totaling requires stillness and darkness and an absence of other input. And standing up in a lit room removes 2 of the 3. It does not answer anything. It interrupts a process that needs continuity to keep going, and interruption is often all that is required. Chapter 32, 26 days. I want to leave the arithmetic and go back to the room on Stellovsky Lane because there is something in it worth taking to sleep. On the 3rd of October, 1866, the situation was hopeless. Not difficult, hopeless. 9 years of his working life were going to be taken. The deadline was in 4 weeks, and the required work did not exist. On the 4th of October, a 20-year-old walked in with a notebook. 26 days later, it was done, and the receipt was in his hand, and the 9 years were his. I am not offering that as inspiration, because the odds in that story were genuinely terrible, and it very nearly did not work. I am offering it as a correction to a specific belief that operates at this hour, which is that the current shape of a situation is its permanent shape. 4 weeks is not very long. He had been unable to write that book for 15 months. And the obstacle turned out to be that he had been trying to do it the wrong way round, and nobody had thought to try it the other way. Some proportion of what you cannot currently do is of that kind, not a failure of capacity, a method that does not suit you, kept in place because it is the one you have always used. There is something else in those 26 days that is worth taking, and it has nothing to do with deadlines. The block was not a block. He had been unable to write that novel for 15 months. Not unwilling. Unable in the way that is genuinely immovable and produces enormous self-contempt, and he had every possible incentive to get it done and could not. And the obstacle turned out to be the medium. Given a person in the room and permission to talk instead of write, the same man produced a short novel in 26 days, and it is the least laboured thing he ever made. 15 months of failure dissolved by a change of format that nobody had thought to try because he had always written with a pen and therefore writing meant a pen. It is worth asking about whatever you have been failing at for a long time, whether you have been failing at the task or at the method you have always used for it. Most people have exactly one way of doing the thing they are stuck on, inherited early, never examined, and experienced not as a choice, but as what the task simply is. Sometimes the 15 months are not about capacity at all. Somebody just needs to suggest a stenographer. One more thing about that fortnight, because it is easy to take the wrong lesson. The lesson is not that pressure produces work. Pressure produced 15 months of nothing. The deadline had been there the whole time and had generated only avoidance and dread, which is what deadlines generally generate. What produced the work was a change in the physical arrangement of the task. Another person in the room, at a fixed hour, every day, with a specific thing to do. If you have been trying to solve a stuck project by increasing the pressure on yourself, that has been tested rather thoroughly by him for over a year, and it does not work. Chapter 33. What he was actually afraid of. One last thing about him. In all those letters, the thing he is most afraid of is not poverty, and it is not the creditors, and it is not prison. It is her finding out how bad it is. And the reason that 4-year cycle eventually broke, when a decade of resolutions had not, is that it never worked. She always knew. He told her every time in detail in writing on the same day. He never once got to have a secret. That is worth more than it sounds. The reason concealment is so destructive is not moral. It is that a hidden problem cannot be worked on by anybody but the person hiding it, and that person has already demonstrated they cannot work on it alone. Whatever your version of it is, the single most useful thing available to you, and it costs nothing and can be done badly, is that one other person knows the real figure. Not everybody. One. It is worth naming the specific fear because it is more common than the behaviour it attaches to. Not poverty, not prison. Being found out by the one person whose good opinion is load-bearing. Almost everybody has one of those. The person whose disappointment would cost more than the consequence itself. And a very large amount of ordinary human concealment is organised entirely around that single individual, at enormous cost for years. The strange mercy in this story is that he never got the chance. He was constitutionally incapable of not telling her. Whatever else was wrong with him, he could not sit on it for an evening. So the fear he had was of something that never once happened, because the disclosure always arrived before the concealment could set. And what he discovered 100 times over was that the thing he was most afraid of losing was not withdrawn, not because she approved, but because her regard had never been contingent on his performance in the first place, and he had spent years not knowing that. That is worth sitting with if there is somebody in your life you are managing rather than talking to. The contingency you are protecting against may be one you invented, and there is only one way to find out, and it is cheaper than the years. It is worth saying what the alternative to concealment actually costs, because people overestimate it enormously. He told her the worst of it, in writing more than 100 times. She did not leave. She did not stop respecting him, as far as any document shows. She did not use it against him afterwards, and when she came to write her memoir 40 years later, she included it rather than tidying it away. The catastrophe he was writing those letters in fear of never arrived, not once, in 14 years of marriage. That is one case, and it proves nothing in general. But it is worth putting beside the certainty you may be carrying about what would happen if you said the number out loud. And one more thing about that one person. It does not have to be the person whose opinion matters most. That is the mistake almost everybody makes. They measure the disclosure against the hardest possible audience, decide it is impossible, and conclude that disclosure in general is impossible. It can be somebody who barely knows you. It can be somebody on a helpline whose name you never learn. The mechanism does not require intimacy. It requires only that the number stops existing exclusively inside your own head, where it has been growing without any external reference for however long it has been. Chapter 34. Nothing tonight. We are nearly at the end. There is no decision to be made tonight. I want to be quite firm about that, because at 1 a.m, in the middle of a total, the mind produces a great many decisions, and every one of them is made by the part of you that is tired, alarmed, and working from a curated file. None of them will be better in the morning. Some of them will look strange in the morning. That is not a failure of nerve. It is what the evidence about decision-making under fatigue and distress would predict. So the instruction for the next hour is simply this. Whatever came up, it is a Tuesday's problem, and this is not Tuesday. He signed the worst contract in Russian literature on an afternoon when the alternative felt unbearable and the future was a rumor. That is what a decision made under pressure looks like, and there is a reason we are still telling the story. And one further note on tonight specifically, because the hour has a particular trick it plays with time. At 3 a.m, the situation you are in feels permanent. Not bad, permanent. That is the specific distortion, and it is the reason this hour produces despair rather than mere worry. The mind at this hour presents the current arrangement as the final arrangement, and everything that follows from that is coloured accordingly. It is worth knowing that this is a known feature of the hour and not a perception of the facts. On the 3rd of October, 1866, the situation was, by any reasonable assessment, finished. 4 weeks, no manuscript, 9 years of work about to be signed away to a man who had engineered the whole thing. 26 days later it was resolved, and the resolution had arrived through the door on the 4th of October in the form of a 20-year-old, with a notebook whose existence he had not known about that morning. I am not offering that as optimism. The odds in that story were genuinely terrible, and it very nearly failed. Only as a correction to the specific false certainty this hour produces, which is that what is true now will keep being true. It very often does not, and the thing that changes it is very often something you could not have predicted because you did not know it existed. There is one more reason to leave it, and it is practical rather than gentle. Nothing is open. Whatever the decision is, the people who would have to be involved are asleep, the offices are closed, the forms cannot be submitted, and the conversation cannot be had. There is literally no action available in the next 6 hours, which means the thinking you are doing now cannot terminate in an act, and thinking that cannot terminate in an act, does not terminate at all. That is not a metaphor for anything. It is the actual reason this hour goes on so long, and it resolves itself at about 8 in the morning when things start being open again. One further note, and then we will start going down. Notice that you have got through every previous night of this, not well, and not without cost, and possibly not with any of it resolved. But the hours between 1 and 5 have arrived many times before, carrying this same material, and each time they ended, and the following day was ordinary. That is not an argument. It is a base rate, and at this hour the base rate is the only honest evidence available, and it points fairly clearly. Chapter 35. What was actually saved? Think about what almost went, and what actually held. Almost gone. 9 years of everything he would write, which would have included Crime and Punishment's Aftermath, The Idiot, The Devils, and The Brothers Karamazov, published for nothing to a man who had bought his debts. What held it? A friend's practical suggestion, a young woman's shorthand, and her knowledge of which police station to go to. Nothing heroic, nothing transformational, no moment of resolve. 3 ordinary practical acts by people who were nearby. If you are waiting to feel different before anything changes, I would gently point out that in the best documented version of this story that anybody has, nobody felt different at any point. The feeling arrived years later, on an afternoon in Wiesbaden, after the practical arrangements had already been made. The feeling follows the arrangements, not the other way round. It is worth putting the whole rescue in one line because of what is absent from it. A friend made a practical suggestion. A stranger did competent work. She knew which police station to go to. There is no courage in that list. There is no transformation, no resolution, no moment of clarity, no decision to be a better man. He did not become disciplined in October 1866, and there is no evidence he became disciplined at any point in the following 5 years, because he did not. What happened is that 3 ordinary people did 3 ordinary things at the right moment, and a disaster did not occur. That is what being saved actually looks like from the inside. And it is almost never what people are waiting for. They are waiting to feel different and to act from that feeling. The feeling, in his case, arrived in April 1871, 5 years later, on an afternoon in Wiesbaden, long after the practical arrangements had been made and had begun to work. It follows the arrangements. It does not lead them. Nobody tells you that. And it is the single most useful thing in this entire story. Let your hands be heavy. Let your breathing be whatever it already is. One last thing about him, and then we're done. He did not stop because he finally understood. He understood the whole time better than anybody and wrote the best description of it that existed. He stopped when the arrangements around him had been changed by somebody else, patiently, over years, in ways that had nothing to do with insight or resolve. A country left, a household reorganized, a business built, a debt cleared, and a wife who declined every single time to tell him what he already knew about himself. It is worth being exact about how long the ordinary part lasted. The gambling occupied about 9 years. The rest of his adult life, after 1871, was 10 years of steady work and a household that functioned. He is remembered for the novels. He is remembered secondarily for having been a gambler. He is not remembered for the decade in which nothing dramatic happened, and he simply wrote, which is the decade that produced the books. The interesting years and the productive years were not the same years, and the productive ones came second and were duller and were made possible by somebody doing the accounts. Chapter 36. Let it be Tuesdays. So here is the last of it, and then I will stop. Whatever it is that you have not been able to stop doing, it is not because you are weak, and it is not because you have not been sorry enough, and it is not because you have failed to understand it. You have been standing in front of a machine that pays out unpredictably with an intact human reward system that files near misses as wins in an environment where the disadvantage is too small to see and too consistent to survive, chasing a total that was never recoverable while being told by everybody, including yourself, that the answer is to try harder. Nothing in that requires a character flaw as an explanation, and taking the character flaw out of the explanation does not excuse anything. It does not make the money come back or undo the years. It only takes away the fuel, because the second layer, the one about what kind of person this makes you, is the part that has been keeping you awake, and it is also the part that is wrong. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let the weight of you settle into whatever is holding it. There is nothing to decide tonight. The total in your head is not a solvable object at this hour, and the installment will still be there on Tuesday, and Tuesday is when installments get done. Put it down on the floor beside the bed. Not resolved, not forgiven, not counted. Just down. He had 10 good years at the end. He did not earn them by becoming a better man, and there is no evidence he ever became one in the way he kept promising in those letters. He got them because somebody nearby changed the arrangements and stopped him from being ashamed, and knew which building to go to on the 1st of November. That is all it took. It is very often all it takes. One more time, quietly, and then I will stop. There is a version of you at 11 tomorrow morning who is going to be upright and dressed and holding something warm and in possession of the entire mind rather than the half of it that is available now. That person is better equipped for this than you are tonight. Not braver, better resourced. They can make a phone call. They can look at an actual number instead of a remembered one. They can say a sentence out loud to somebody who is awake. Everything that needs doing belongs to them, and they will be here in a few hours, and they do not need you to have prepared anything. So there is genuinely nothing left for tonight. Not as a comfort, as an accurate description of what is available in a dark room at this hour, which is nothing, and has been nothing for the whole time you have been lying here working on it. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let the weight of your legs go into the mattress and your hands and the back of your head. The total will still be there. It has been there for years, and it survived every previous night without your attention, and it will survive tonight. You are allowed to put it down without having solved it. That is not giving up. It is only the correct thing to do with an object that cannot be lifted at this hour by anybody. There is nothing further to work out tonight. Sleep now.